The following is called Billy Blake's Trial. It was an article written by Brian Doyle, who was the editor of Portland magazine, that took him 5 years to research and write. It was obviously, as you'll be able to tell by the end, a labor of love. Billy Blake's Trial. A cold January day, Chichester, England. A fitfully wet day along the English coast, according to the Sussex Weekly Advertiser. Mid-morning, a melancholy time. Too early for lunch, too early for whiskey, breakfast a fond memory. In the Chichester Guildhall, a man named Youatt, a minister, strolls into the courtroom. He is a court recorder charged with a shorthand accounting of trial proceedings. The room in which he found himself was probably made almost entirely of wood. Wooden benches, wooden railings, a wooden witness box, adjacent to the wooden magistrate's seat, wooden floor, and sometimes a wooden judge. There were probably 2 oil paintings to either side of the magistrate's seat. One was almost certainly of the king, George III, at the time. The other was usually of a national hero of some sort. Let us say it is a portrait of the genius poet John Milton, a man who looked like a draft cart horse. Both paintings were probably enormous, as huge paintings were then considered quite dashing. No other ornaments are visible in the room, although there are almost certainly mountains of loose papers on the 2 counselors' tables. Nothing happens to the Reverend Mr. Youatt in his wooden room for a good long while. In a sense, this stultifying pause is very English. Nothing happens for long stretches in England. It is the English way. White bread, thin tea, a land of hedgerows and gardens, a dreamy land. A land amidst which the people dream of order and porter. On this day, however, in about 15 minutes, Mr. William Blake, age 47, a resident of nearby Felpham for 3 years, will be tried for sedition against George III, King of England. Said treasonous acts being assault and battery on the person of Private John Schofield of the Royal Dragoon Guards, and dragging the private down the street by his collar, and stuffing the said private bodily into his barracks, and the vehement utterance of many seditious phrases, such as "Damn the King," "You soldiers are all slaves," and if Bonaparte should come, he would be a master of Europe in an hour's time, and so forth. The case, Rex versus Blake, will be tried before a jury, 6 magistrates, and the Duke of Richmond, counsel for the defense, Mr. Samuel Rose. First witness for the prosecution, Private John Cock of the Royal Dragoon Guards. Witnesses for the defense, various. Now is my grief at worst incapable of being surpassed, but every moment it accumulates more and more. It continues accumulating to eternity. The joys of God advance, but my griefs advance also forever and ever without end. Oh, that I could cease to be despair. I am despair. Created to be the great example of horror and agony, also my prayer is vain. I called for compassion, compassion mocked, mercy and pity through the gravestone over me, and with lead and iron bound it over me forever. Blake was nervous about the trial, damn nervous. It had already cost him £100 simply for bail, money he had to borrow from friends. The prospect of losing the case was terrifying. England had declared war on Napoleon in May. The country was an unruly bundle of nerves, and rumors of French invasion were rife amongst the southern coast. It was also rumored that Napoleon had assembled fleets of flatboats in every creek and harbor on the Channel. To fend off these invaders, troops of dragoons had been quartered in various coastal towns. Thus came Schofield's troop to Felpham. Under these circumstances, few accusations could be more serious than that of sedition, and the fact that Schofield was a soldier boded ill. Added to the actual physical danger of Blake's position was its inconvenient timing. Blake and his wife Catherine had already spent this last year in Felpham itching to leave. They were ready to move back to London in September when Schofield filed charges in August. Felpham, which Blake had hoped would be, quote, a sweet place for study, unquote, had been a bust. Catherine was constantly sick. His neighbor William Haley badgered him incessantly. The weather was unrelentingly, angrily, eternally gray. London, which he had fled, cursing its filth and meanness, now looked delicious. Quote, I can carry on my visionary studies in London unannoyed, unquote, he wrote to his London friend Thomas Butts. There I can converse with my friends in eternity, see visions, dream dreams, and prophecy, speak parables unobserved and at liberty from the doubts of other mortals. I assure you that, if I could have returned to London a month after my arrival here, I should have done so. But I was commanded by my spiritual friends to bear all, to be silent, and to go through all without murmuring. What is the price of experience? Do men buy it for a song? Or wisdom for a dance in the street? No, it is bought with the price of all that a man has, his house, his wife, his children. Wisdom is sold in the desolate market where none come to buy, and in the withered field where the farmer plows for bread in vain. In Felpham, Blake had hired a man named William to tend his garden. The man was a hostler, or horse groom, at the nearby Fox Inn. On the morning of August 12th, Blake emerged from his cottage to find two men in his garden. One was William, the other was Private Schofield, who, unbeknownst to Blake, had been invited into the garden by the gardener. In a letter to Butts, Blake explained, I desired Schofield, as politely as possible, to get out of my garden. He made me an impertinent answer. I insisted on his leaving the garden. He refused. I still persisted in desiring his departure. He then threatened to knock out my eyes. And with many abominable imprecations and some contempt for my person, it affronted my foolish pride. I therefore took him by the elbows and pushed him before me until I had got him out. There I had intended to left him, but he, turning about, put himself into a posture of defiance, threatening and swearing at me. I, perhaps foolishly and perhaps not, stepping out of the gate and putting aside his blows, took him again by the elbows, and keeping his back to me, pushed him forward down the road about 50 yards. He all the while endeavoring to turn around and strike me, raging and cursing, which drew out several neighbors at length. When I got him to where he was quartered, which was quickly done, we were met at the gate by the master of the Fox Inn, who is the proprietor of my cottage, and his wife and daughter, and the man's comrade and several other people. My landlord compelled the soldiers to go indoors after many abusive threats against me and my wife from the two soldiers, but not one word of threat on the account of sedition was uttered at that time. And then the knave begins to snarl and the hypocrite to howl, and all his good friends show their private ends, and the eagle is known from the owl. 3 days later, Private Schofield swore out a formal complaint of sedition, by the miniature painter, as it were, William Blake, against the king. Schofield's account had Blake delivering a lengthy and bloodthirsty speech, during which he shouted that he would cut the throats of his fellow Englishmen at Bonaparte's command, among other savageries. Schofield also swore Mrs. Blake issued forth from the cottage like a fury, and shouted that although she was but a woman, she would fight for Bonaparte as long as she had a drop of blood in her. Schofield's account ends with Mrs. Blake telling her said husband to eject the soldier, with Blake seizing the peaceful Schofield by the collar, and with Blake damning the king as loudly at the top of his voice. Cold snows drifted around them, ice covered his loins around. The matter went to grand jury October 1803 as the Michaelmas Quarter Sessions in nearby Pentworth. Blake attended, accompanied by his gardener. To Blake's dismay, the jury found Schofield's charges of sedition and assault worthy of trial. The bills were true, as it were, in the phrase of the day, which meant that he would be formally tried before a judge and jury in January. It was Blake's right as defendant to provide the court with his account of the matter if he so chose, and to list points of evidence that he or his lawyer would muster up in his defense. Blake did so in a businesslike memorandum titled "In Refutation of the Information and Complaint of John Schofield, a Private Soldier, etc." The memo ends with this editorial flourish. If such perjury as this can take effect, any villain in the future may come and drag me and my wife out of our house, beat us in the garden, or use as he please, or is able, and afterwards go and swear our lives away. Is it not in the power of any thief who enters a man's dwelling and robs him or misuses his wife or children to go and swear as this man has sworn? Lo seized his hammer and tongs, he labored at his resolute anvil. Among infinite, indefinite druid rocks and snows of doubt and reasoning, enraged and stifled without and within, in terror and in woe, he threw his right arm to the north, his left arm to the south, and his feet stamped the nether abyss in trembling, howling, and dismay. Enter, with a hacking cough, Mr. Samuel Rose. He is thin and sickly man, about 30 years old, a friend of both Haley and the poet William Cowper. Haley, who has already shelled out for most of Blake's bail, hires Rose to defend Blake at the Chichester sessions. The prosecution argued first, as is the custom to this day in English and American law, and after a statement of the charge by Private Schofield and corroborating testimony by Private Cock, Schofield's lawyer hammered away at the atrocity and malignity of the charge, figuring that if the jury could be awed by the seditious imprecations that had supposedly issued from Blake's mouth, they would ignore the fact that the only eyewitness, the hostler, was prepared to swear that Blake had said nothing of the kind. This tactic, called prosecuting the crime, sometimes works with serious charges, since juries are anxious to assign blame for such crimes. The more serious the offense, the more likely they are to convict someone. Counselor Rose tooled his defense accordingly. His speech, taken in shorthand by the Reverend Mr. Youatt, opens with a complete agreement that such an offense is atrocious and malignant beyond words. Quote, "If there be a man who can be found guilty of such a transgression, he must apply to some other person to defend him," says Rose icily. "I certainly think that such an offense is incapable of extenuation, My task is to show that my client is not guilty of the words imputed to him. It is not to show that those words are capable of any mitigated sense. Having distanced himself and his client from the deviltry of the charge, Rose methodically set out the pieces of his argument like chessmen. 1. Blake has been a loyal subject of the king for all of his 47 years. 2. Blake is a friend of the local hero and noted patriot Haley, who would never have allowed a rebel into his house. 3. Blake is an artist, and therefore apolitical. His art has a tendency, like all other fine arts, to soften every asperity of feeling and character, and to secure the bosom from the influence of those tumultuous and discordant passions which destroy the happiness of mankind. 4. Schofield is an undependable witness. He has been broken from sergeant to private on account of drunkenness. 5. The charge prima facie doesn't make sense. Is Blake, a sensitive artist, likely to storm from his house to utter malignant and unintelligible discourse to those most likely to injure him for it? 6. The hostler who saw and heard the whole row denies the charge wholly. 7. The testimony of Private Cock, who stated that he emerged from the barracks to hear Blake damning the king, country, and soldiers, is contradicted by a woman, Mrs. Grinder, who is next to Cock by the door of the barracks, who says the poet said nothing of the kind. I will call my witnesses, the hostler and Mrs. Grinder, and you shall hear their account, sums up Rose. You will then agree with me that they totally overthrow the testimony of these soldiers. At this point, shockingly, Rose collapsed, overcome with the tension and with the effects of a nervous disease that would kill him a few months later. The court was in an uproar for several minutes. Lightnings of discontent broke on all sides round, and murmurs of thunder rolling heavy, long, and loud over the mountains. Rose was helped to his feet, but he could not carry on. And because there was suddenly no defense lawyer, the defense witness was not called. The chairman of the bench of magistrates, the Duke of Richmond, who according to Haley disliked Blake intensely and was for political reasons itching to convict him, sent the jury off to its deliberations, and the packed house settled to wait for a verdict. It could not have been much later than 2 o'clock in the afternoon when the jury retired. The trial had begun at 10 in the morning. Only the 2 soldiers had testified, and there had been only one full-length summation, that by the prosecution. If we generously allow half an hour for Rose's suddenly aborted speech, it is 1,650 words in Youatt's account, and guess that there was a lunch break, or an adjournment of some kind, or that Blake's repeated shouting of false. During Schofield's testimony, a boy at the trial later told the journalist Alexander Gilchrist that what he remembered best from that day was Blake's powerful flashing eye. Or that attending to the fallen Rose may have taken a while. We may have pushed the clock to 3 o'clock or so, but the jury did not return its verdict until nearly 8 o'clock in the evening. So Blake sat there in the courtroom at the Guildhall on a dank day, his lawyer silenced, his wife sick at home, his freedom and future in the hands of people he did not know, in a country he had been itching to leave for years, for 5 hours. How long will ye vex my soul and break me with pieces, with words? If this essay were a movie, there would be a natural break at this point. The camera would pan around Blake sitting there at the table, his eyes flashing, the murmuring crowd staring at him, and the Duke of Richmond glaring from the bench, Schofield glaring from the prosecution table, Rose wheezing in the corner, Haley up on the balcony signing autographs, the Reverend Mr. Youatt leaning back in his chair exhausted. Perhaps the camera would zoom in on Blake's round face. He had a broad, pale face and a large full eye, wrote the memoirist Crabb Robinson. Always keying in on his eyes, using the ferocious glare in them as an anchor for the frame. His eyes were gray and slightly protuberant, in effect heightened by his receding hairline. He had a firm chin, a considerable nose, and the look of a furious hawk when he was angry. The camera sidles up to Blake's face, the hubbub in the room gets a little louder. Blake turns slightly to stare right into the camera, his glaring eye filling the frame. The camera here does a fade and flip so fast it barely registers on the viewer, and now it is retreating from the same ferocious eye, but the eye is on the face of 4-year-old Billy Blake, second son of James Blake, hosier and haberdasher, and we're into the flashback scene, which will cover in a series of cross-cut jumps the 43 years between 1761, when Blake H. 4 saw God, quote, who put his head in the window and set him screaming, unquote, according to his wife, and 1804, when Blake is the quiet eye of a swirling hubbub in Chichester's Guildhall. At age 8, Blake reported to his mother that he had seen the prophet Ezekiel under a tree. His mother beat him. At age 10, he reported he had seen a tree filled with angels, their bright angelic wings bespangling every bough like stars. His father beat him. A month later, he stood at the edge of a field watching haymakers at work. He saw angels walking toward him through the rye. His parents stopped beating him and sent him to art school, a decision made easier because the boy was a booby who spent all his time in his father's haberdashery drawing on the backs of receipts. At age 14, he became an engraver. At age 24, he married a slim, dark-haired, dark-eyed girl named Catherine, who calmed him by cupping his feet in her hands when he shook with visions. For the next 23 years, Blake drew, painted, engraved, printed, colored, stippled, and lithographed. He opened a print shop that immediately failed. He invented a new form of engraving after he had a dream in which his dead brother Robert explained it to him. He wrote songs and then simple poems and vast books of complex poems, many of which he engraved and printed himself, in volumes that he and Catherine painted and bound by hand. They lived on Green Street, Broad Street, Poland Street, the Hercules Buildings, Felpham, South Moulton Street, and in the Strand. He sometimes made money and often did not. Mostly he did not. To earn a living, he did engravings on commission and drawings and watercolors for books and magazines. Meanwhile, at night, at dawn, and often when he was supposed to be working on commissions, he wrote his epic poems and engraved them onto copper plates and printed them and watercolored the sheets and bound them into books, which he offered for sale at outrageous prices. Here are the names of some of his books: The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, The Book of Loss, The Everlasting Gospel, The Book of Thel, The Book of Urizen, The Song of Loss, The Four Zoas, Songs of Innocence and Experience showing the two contrary states of the human soul, Milton, and Jerusalem. These last two were among his last works, and both were begun at Feltham before the trial. It is quite possible that Blake was writing Milton on the morning of August 12th, when he walked out into his garden and noticed Private John Schofield of His Majesty's Royal Dragoons standing at the garden gate with a sneer upon his face. "If you account it wisdom when you are angry to be silent and not to show it, I do not account that wisdom but folly. Every man's wisdom is peculiar to his own individuality." Between 3 o'clock, when the jury retired, and 8 o'clock, when the foreman stood to announce the verdict, Blake probably remained seated. Possibly he read, drew, or painted. He apparently had an astonishing capacity for concentration, and he often spent 8 hours at a time writing or drawing. It may be in this case that he simply sat in the room thinking. There were no rules then, as there are none now, about activity during intermission in trials. While the jury is deliberating, the accused, if she or he is not physically restrained, may stand on his head, imitate a cricket, mutter poems, or stare abstractly into space. But this interregnum ends at the moment that the jury files back into the courtroom. The foreman stands. William Blake stands, stretches himself to his full height, about 5 feet 5 inches, and waits to hear whether he will be a free man or whether he will be deported to Australia or hung by the neck until dead. Every night and every morn some to misery are born. Every morn and every night some are born to sweet delight. Some are born to sweet delight, some are born to endless night. The courtroom hushes. Blake's eyes are nearly popping out of his head as the foreman forms the words. Not, and then with a rush as the crowd begins to roar, guilty, and the courtroom explodes. In defiance of all decency, the Sussex Weekly Advertiser reported the court was, quote, thrown into an uproar by noisy exultations. Blake was rushed out of the Guildhall in a roaring tide of townspeople. Haley, ecstatic at the verdict, paused to drip some sarcasm on the judge, who he thought was bitterly prejudiced against Blake. "I congratulate your grace," said Haley unctuously, "that after having been wearied by the condemnation of sorry vagrants, you have at last had the gratification of seeing an honest man honorably delivered from an infamous persecution. Mr. Blake is pacific, industrious, and a deserving artist." "I know nothing of him," snapped the Duke. "True, my Lord Grace can know nothing of him," said Haley, driving home Lance. "And I have therefore given you this information. I wish your Grace a good night." And off he went with Blake to dinner at the home of a mutual friend, Mrs. Poole. I think about that dinner once in a while, what they ate, what Blake thought, who got drunk. Probably Haley pontificated, for he did that well, and he had, after all, paid all Blake's legal fees. I suppose Mrs. Poole smiled happily on her friend Blake, released from the shadow of the noose. And Billy Blake, did he drink too much? Was he merry? Or did he sit there like a rock in a stream and think about his darling Kate sick in her bed in their new flat in London, and in his mind take her in his arms and tell her, "Kate, we are free, 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 Kate, free. And the world will never bind us, and we will forge ahead, make our art, and start over and earn our bread and worship the Lord and be free, free, free at last." A red robin breast in a cage puts all heaven in a rage. A dove house filled with doves and pigeons shudders hell through all its regions. William Blake, poet and printer, disappears almost completely from public record after his trial. From 1804 through 1809, he scrambled without much success to make a decent living as an engraver. In 1809, he held a one-man show of his paintings at his brother's house. The show failed miserably, and its only reviewer, Robert Hunt of the Examiner magazine, called Blake an unfortunate lunatic. In 1812, he exhibited 4 paintings at the Watercolor Society. In 1816, he was listed in a biographical dictionary of the living authors of Great Britain and Ireland, although the entry made him out to be an eccentric. From 1808 to 1819, Blake sold perhaps a couple of dozen engravings per year. He told an art dealer that he and Catherine made do many years on an income of about a guinea a week, the equivalent today of living for 7 days on about $20. He kept working, though. "I never stop," he told one friend. And the years slipped by, until in 1827 he was suddenly 70 years old, being only bones and sinews, all strings and bobbins, like a weaver's loom, as he described it. Tremblingly I sit day and night, my friends are astonished at me, yet they forgive my wanderings. I rest not from my great task. I have been writing this essay about Blake's trial for over a year now. I've been taking notes for it for 5 years. Over the course of those years, I've asked myself many, many times, why am I doing this? A careful account of the trial for sedition of the poet and printer William Blake in the year 1804 on a fitfully wet day in January in a wooden room by the sea. Why? Because this essay is my way of befriending and comprehending Billy Blake, whom I greatly admire in absentia. Why do I admire Blake so? Because he told the truth. Because he showed an insolent, leering soldier down the road and stuffed him through a doorway. Because he saw angels and saints and talked openly about his visions. Because he published his work himself. Because he was a tender, difficult, and solicitous friend. Because he took great pride in his engraving and worked endlessly on plates to make them perfect. Because when he knew he was going to die, he lay in his bed singing softly. Because he smiled at the deft poetry of the message when his wife served him an empty plate at dinner to remind him that they were starving. Because he wasn't satisfied with extant mythology and built so vast and grand, impenetrable one of his own. Because in all things, he wrote, he never mentioned his weight, which was ample, or his height, which was not. Because he single-handedly rescued the ampersand from oblivion. Because in a few drawings of him he is alert, intent, and attentive. Because even though he claimed much of his work was dictated whole to him by angels and prophets, he edited heavily. Because he and his wife used to sit naked in their garden and recite passages from Paradise Lost. Because when he was asked to recite his poems at parties, he insisted on getting up and removing his coat and singing his lyrics aloud while dancing around the room, which is why he was subsequently not invited to parties anymore. Because he taught his wife, a grocer's daughter, to read. Because he rose every morning and laid the fire and made tea for her. Because he was endlessly exuberant. Because once at a dinner party he said to the child next to him, "May God make this world as beautiful to you as it has been to me." A sentence this child remembered the rest of her adult life. Because he held his opinions firmly. Because his wife said she never saw his hand still unless he was asleep. Because to walk with him was like walking on air and talking with the prophet Isaiah, said his young friend George Richmond. By the way, no relation to the Duke. Because he took great care to leave no debt at his death. because he wrote and then threw away 6 or 7 epic poems as long as Homer and 20 tragedies as long as Macbeth, judging them not worthy of publication or engraving. Because in the ringing fury of his lines there is also great mercy. Because even when he was sick unto death, he engraved a little business card for his old friend George Cumberland. Because he could not stop painting and died with a pencil in his hand. Because he bought a new pencil 2 days before he died. Because the very last thing he drew was his wife's face. It was this last detail that catches my heart. But thou, O Lord, do with me as thou wilt, for I am nothing and vanity. I have scoured many books for the accounts of Blake's last day. I'm not sure why we all die in the end, and the grace or gracelessness with which we leave is meat only for the morbid. Yet I want to know how Billy Blake stepped into the next room. I want to know how firmly he held his opinions in the face of annihilation. I want to hear his heart. I want to know him in the last moments that he wore a body like mine, in the last moments that he may have seen crows, spoons, apples, angels. He died on a Sunday in late summer. By this time he was completely bedridden. His ankles frightfully swelled, his chest disordered, old age striding on, noted a friend. Blake himself knew that he had not long to live. Dear Cumberland, he scribbled in April, I've been very near the gates of death and returned weak, and an old man, feeble and tottering, but not in spirit and life, not in the real man, the imagination which liveth forever. In that I am stronger and stronger as this foolish body decays. On the morning of August 12th, exactly 23 years to the day after he met Private John Schofield of His Majesty's Royal Dragoons, Blake awoke early and painted for a couple of hours. Then, according to his wife, he said, I have done all I can, and he dropped the painting on the floor. She sat by his bedside. Kate, stay as you are. You have been an angel to me. I will draw you, he said. And when the drawing was finished, he signed it, Mrs. Blake, drawn by Blake, and wrote her name in large letters under his signature. Then he began to sing. He sang hallelujahs and songs of joy and triumph with true ecstatic energy for the rest of the afternoon, hymns, and then for hours his own poems. At about 6 o'clock, he told Catherine that he was going to that country that all his life he had wished to see, and that he would always be about her. Then wrote his friend George Richmond, who was at his bedside. His countenance became fair. His eyes brightened, and he burst out singing of the things he saw in heaven. And then he passed. Have pity upon me, O ye my friends, for the hand of God hath touched me. After a minute, Richmond reached over and closed his eyes to keep the visions in, as he said. Richmond then left. As he paused in the door, he looked back. The last thing he saw, he wrote later, was Catherine kissing William's hands. Catherine died 4 years later. She often talked to her husband as if he were in the room. And in her last hour, she called continually to him to inform him of her arrival and would not be long from his side. It is said she died with one of his pencils in her hand.